Dawn, Normandy, summer 1944. The morning mist clung to the fields outside a small French village. The low sun reflected off damp earth and twisted hedgerows. From the tree line, German soldiers peered through the fog, rifles at the ready, Panzerfaust strapped to their chests, expecting the usual harried infantry. Then they heard it, a deep mechanical roar that did not belong to artillery or trucks. Out of the mist, a line of Sherman tanks emerged, their tracks cutting through mud with relentless precision. Steel hulls glinted, gun barrels pivoting toward known German positions. Machine gunners braced, hearts quickening, eyes fixed on the approaching metal. Anti-tank teams fumbled with shells and triggers, calculating distance, angles, timing. Yet the Shermans did not falter. They moved steadily, crushing obstacles under tracks, returning fire when met, seemingly impervious to the anti-tank mines and grenades laid carefully to stop them. Within minutes, the Germans realized that the armored line advancing on them was not stopping, not hesitating, not broken by the first volleys. Shock rippled through the trenches and foxholes. Men exchanged panicked glances. This was a weapon they had feared, tested, reported, and studied. Yet here it came, rolling into their defenses unscathed. The battlefield had shifted, and everything the German defenders had relied upon would be tested in the next hours. The Sherman arrives. By 1942, the Allies faced a pressing need for an armored vehicle that could be produced in large numbers, transported across oceans, and operated reliably under varied conditions. The United States answered with the M4 Sherman, a medium tank designed for versatility rather than perfection. Its chassis balanced speed, armor, and firepower, making it ideal for the logistical and tactical demands of a global war. The Sherman's armor could resist small arms and lighter anti-tank weapons, though it was vulnerable to heavier German guns like the 75mm PaK-40 and the 88mm Flak/Tiger cannons. Crews accepted these limitations because numbers and mobility could compensate. Where a single Tiger could stop an advance, multiple Shermans could overwhelm it by coordinated assault, flanking, and combined arm support. Production was a marvel of industrial efficiency. By 1944, tens of thousands had been built, allowing the U.S. and British forces to plan operations with unprecedented armor density. Shermans were shipped to North Africa, then Italy, and finally across the English Channel for the invasion of Normandy. Each vehicle carried a 5-man crew: commander, gunner, loader, driver, and co-driver/bow machine gunner. Training emphasized rapid decision-making, target prioritization, and coordination with infantry. The Allies paired Shermans with infantry and engineers in deliberate combined arms doctrine. Artillery, air support, and tank-busting units were synchronized to create maximum effect. Tank platoons moved in patterns that minimized exposure, using terrain, smoke, and speed to close with enemy positions. Engineers followed closely to breach obstacles, minefields, and fortified hedgerows. German forces, by contrast, had relied heavily on fortified positions and mobile reserves to counter Allied armor. The Atlantic Wall, hedgerows, and prepared fields of fire were designed to channel tanks into kill zones. Anti-tank weapons were embedded in nearly every defensive position. Panzerfausts, PaK-40s, and captured artillery pieces waited to strike. Yet the Germans assumed these obstacles would slow attackers into predictable paths, allowing even older, static guns to inflict heavy losses. When the Shermans rolled into these zones in 1944, many German units faced a reality their calculations had not anticipated. Tanks advancing with coordination, speed, and a protection that often exceeded expectation. Reports from frontline observers reveal that the first encounters caused immediate shock, disorientation, and hesitation, a psychological advantage that compounded the tank's physical effectiveness. The Sherman was not invincible, but in Normandy, its deployment represented a new chapter in armored warfare. Overwhelming presence, concentrated mobility, and the ability to exploit the gaps and confusion of a prepared defense. And on the morning of the engagement, German soldiers would witness firsthand the consequences of that strategy. Facing the German defenses, The terrain into which the Shermans advanced was designed to punish armored assaults. In Normandy, small villages were surrounded by hedgerows, thick, sunken banks of earth interlaced with trees and stone. Each hedgerow acted as a natural bunker, concealing anti-tank teams and machine gunners. Roads were narrow, fields irregular, and open areas exposed. Mines, stakes, and wire were positioned to channel vehicles into kill zones pre-registered by German artillery observers. German units defending these sectors were a mix of experienced veterans and hastily mobilized conscripts. Infantry companies were trained to wait for tanks to enter designated zones before firing, using both handheld Panzerfausts and field guns. Bunkers and pillboxes were oriented toward expected approaches, assuming that attackers would proceed cautiously, calling out commands and forming conventional columns. Yet several factors undermined these defenses. Allied air superiority disrupted reconnaissance and limited German visibility. Naval and artillery bombardments preceding landings damaged key positions and destroyed observation posts. The defenders were aware that Sherman tanks had relatively thin armor against heavy guns, but the sheer number and coordinated approach of the assault created a situation where hesitation or miscalculation could be fatal. German doctrine relied on timing, coordination, and concentrated firepower. A single well-aimed shell could disable a Sherman, but multiple tanks advancing in dispersed waves forced defenders to choose targets under extreme pressure. Conflicting reports from forward observers compounded the confusion. Some units claimed tanks were destroyed, others saw them moving unscathed through fields, sometimes emerging behind hedgerows that should have stopped them. The psychological impact on German soldiers was profound. Reports and memoirs describe surprise and disbelief at Shermans moving forward despite fire that would have halted any infantry assault. Commanders on the ground had to make rapid decisions with incomplete information, commit reserves, hold fire to conserve ammunition, or retreat to secondary lines. Each choice carried risk, and in several cases, the advance of Shermans created gaps that would be exploited by infantry and artillery following behind. By the time the first waves reached the main line of German resistance, the combination of terrain, tactical doctrine, and psychological shock had already begun to favor the Americans. The battlefield was no longer simply a physical space. It had become a test of perception, timing, and human endurance. The Sherman tanks, moving methodically and almost unyielding, would turn that test into a decisive moment. 1. The human angle, crews in motion. Inside each Sherman, 5 men operated with precise roles, each aware that a single mistake could be fatal. The driver guided the vehicle over churned fields, craters, and hedgerows, his hands gripping controls while artillery fire shook the hull. The gunner adjusted the turret for targets, often partially obscured by smoke or debris. The commander coordinated with infantry and neighboring tanks, relying on hand signals when radios failed. Accounts from survivors describe a tension unlike any other battlefield experience. There was no shouting, only the mechanical hum of engines, the occasional report of a gun, and the steady movement forward. Every action was measured, every pause calculated. Fear existed, but it was disciplined, channeled into focus. The tank crews were insulated physically from bullets that would have torn through unarmored soldiers, but the psychological weight of responsibility was immense. 2. The tactical angle, breaking the expected patterns. German defenses were designed to channel vehicles into kill zones. Sherman tactics, however, deliberately avoided predictability. Tanks advanced in dispersed formations, supporting infantry, suppressing bunkers, and using hedgerows as cover when possible. When obstacles blocked progress, engineers followed, clearing paths while tanks provided covering fire. This approach disrupted German calculations. Infantry waiting to ambush advancing armor found targets moving in unexpected directions. Anti-tank crews hesitated, unsure whether a Sherman would turn into their field of fire or skirt past. By exploiting terrain, timing, and coordination, American forces turned the Sherman into a weapon of surprise as well as strength. 3. The psychological angle, shock and awe without sound. The most immediate effect on German soldiers was shock. They had trained, drilled, and prepared for armored attacks. Yet the sight of multiple Shermans advancing, seemingly impervious to small arms and light artillery, created a moment of disbelief. Reports note soldiers freezing, hesitating, and sometimes retreating without orders. The psychological impact extended beyond immediate fear. When tanks appeared unscathed after initial volleys, it undermined confidence in defensive positions. Commanders were forced to make decisions with incomplete or inaccurate information. That hesitation, amplified across multiple sectors, allowed Shermans to penetrate further and faster than raw firepower alone could have achieved. Point 4. The technological angle, armor and firepower. The Sherman was designed for reliability and mass production rather than invincibility. Its 75mm main gun could penetrate most German light and medium vehicles, while its 51 to 75mm frontal armor resisted small arms and lighter anti-tank weapons. Crucially, the tank's suspension and track system allowed it to cross soft fields, shell-crater terrain, and hedgerows with fewer immobilizations than German designs. Engineers had added modifications over time: sand shields, improved engines, and specialized attachments, allowing Shermans to operate in environments that would have stalled slower or heavier vehicles. Mobility allowed crews to reposition under fire, flank defensive positions, and exploit gaps in the line. The German expectation of a stationary target was systematically undermined by these technological attributes, contributing directly to the surprise and shock on the battlefield. 5. The enemy angle, German command, and confusion. From the German perspective, the assault was chaotic. Observation posts reported tanks appearing where none were expected. Anti-tank teams fired at targets that moved unpredictably, often without apparent coordination. Telephone lines and radios were disrupted by bombardment, leaving units isolated. German commanders faced a dilemma: engage the advancing Shermans and risk overextension, or hold positions and risk penetration. This indecision slowed counterattacks and amplified the psychological impact of the American advance. Post-battle reports reveal repeated expressions of disbelief that so many tanks could survive initial fire and still reach our lines. 6. The leadership angle, command and motion. American leadership emphasized decentralized decision-making. Platoon leaders and tank commanders were empowered to act independently, exploiting openings without waiting for orders from above. When obstacles blocked routes, tank crews and infantry improvised, creating new paths and supporting each other dynamically. This flexibility contrasted sharply with German doctrine, which depended on centralized control. Delays in orders, hesitation to commit reserves, and reliance on predicted patterns allowed Shermans to exploit gaps before counterattacks could be organized. Leaders on the Allied side often led from the front, visible to both their own soldiers and the enemy, reinforcing momentum through presence rather than noise. By the time the first Shermans breached the German front line, both human and technological factors combined to create a turning point. Men and machines moving in concert, exploiting confusion, and achieving effects far beyond what conventional expectation had predicted. The first breach. It was mid-morning when the first wave of Shermans rolled into the German lines. The village streets and open fields were crisscrossed with trenches and anti-tank ditches, yet the tanks moved forward with measured speed. Their engines hummed, tracks churning mud, as they approached positions that were expected to stop them dead. At approximately 9:15, the lead Sherman reached a fortified hedgerow. German soldiers trained to fire at exposed flanks, unleashed Panzerfausts and Pak-40 rounds. Some shells struck the armor, denting and sparking, but none penetrated. The Sherman returned fire with its 75mm gun, targeting observation posts and machine gun nests. Within minutes, several bunkers fell silent. The second and third waves followed, taking advantage of suppressed positions. Infantry moving alongside the tanks exploited the disorientation caused by armored presence. Small units, previously pinned down by gunfire, now advanced under the protective shadow of the Shermans, consolidating footholds in hedgerow gaps. German artillery observers scrambled to reorient, but the dispersed movement of the tanks and infantry made accurate fire nearly impossible. Reports noted confusion. Crews were firing at tanks already behind them or disappearing into cover, unable to predict where the next Sherman would appear. By 10:30, the initial defensive line was fractured. Shermans had created multiple breaches along the front, forcing German infantry to retreat to secondary positions. The combination of armor, firepower, and coordinated movement had turned a prepared defense into a fragmented and reactive posture. The battlefield had shifted. What had been a static line of entrenched defenders became a dynamic environment where the momentum was entirely with the Americans. By noon, the Shermans had advanced several hundred meters beyond the original front line. German commanders attempted counterattacks with infantry and small artillery units, but these efforts were piecemeal and uncoordinated. Tanks had disrupted observation points and communications, leaving counterattacking forces blind to both position and strength. Near a cluster of farm buildings, a Sherman platoon maneuvered to flank a fortified position. Crew reports indicate that multiple Panzerfaust struck, yet the tanks pressed forward. Each impact that failed to penetrate reinforced the psychological dominance of armor over infantry defenses. German soldiers, witnessing vehicles surviving direct hits, began retreating in small groups, abandoning machine guns, and sometimes leaving positions entirely unoccupied. Simultaneously, American engineers breached anti-tank ditches and cleared paths through hedgerows, allowing follow-on armor and infantry to exploit the openings. By 1400 hours, secondary defensive lines were under threat. Communications within German units were fragmented. Orders to fall back often arrived too late or conflicted with local situational awareness. At approximately 15:30, a Sherman squadron advanced to a strategic crossroads. German heavy weapons teams attempted a last stand, but concentrated American artillery, machine gun support, and the presence of multiple Shermans made resistance unsustainable. Within minutes, the road was under Allied control, allowing reinforcements and supplies to flow inland. By late afternoon, the German front in this sector was effectively collapsed. The Shermans had not only survived the initial defenses, but had reshaped the battlefield, creating a corridor for infantry and support units. What had begun as a test of armor and training had become a decisive shift in operational momentum. The implications were immediate. A previously impregnable line was breached, German morale faltered, and the stage was set for a broader advance, counting the costs. By evening, the battlefield bore the marks of the day's armored advance. Craters, twisted hedgerows, and abandoned positions littered the terrain. Sherman tanks rested behind hedgerows, some lightly damaged, most operational. Infantry moved forward, securing objectives previously considered inaccessible. American casualties were significant, but manageable compared to the breakthrough achieved. Reports from the engagement indicate that tank crews suffered injuries primarily from shrapnel, mines, and small arms fire. Very few Shermans were destroyed outright in the sector. Infantry casualties were heavier in exposed areas, but were reduced by the protective cover provided by the tanks. German units had suffered both material and psychological losses. Frontline infantry were scattered, command lines disrupted, and anti-tank teams decimated or forced to withdraw. Resistance nests intended to dominate approaches were neutralized, and remaining forces were relegated to secondary positions, often without coherent coordination. German after-action reports noted repeated astonishment at the durability of the Sherman tanks and the speed with which gaps in the line were exploited. Supplies and reinforcements flowed through the breached lines, enabling Allied forces to consolidate positions. Engineers and artillery units followed, establishing defensive measures and preparing for subsequent operations. The momentum of the day was clearly with the Americans. What had started as a carefully planned assault became an operational advantage that German forces could neither immediately contain nor reverse. Yet even with the breakthrough, the war in Normandy continued. The battle for hedgerows and villages stretched into weeks, but the success of Sherman's in piercing the front lines had changed the tactical calculus. The Germans now faced an armored force that combined mobility, resilience, and coordinated infantry support in a way they had not fully anticipated. Ripples beyond the front. In the days following the engagement, the consequences of a Sherman advance became evident across the sector. German reports revealed a pattern of disrupted logistics. Supply lines were cut, field communications were fragmented, and units that had been expected to hold terrain were forced into defensive pockets. Commanders noted that even when reinforcements arrived, the advantage had shifted irreversibly. Allied forces used the momentum to push further inland. Infantry and armor moved through gaps created by Sherman's, linking with neighboring units and securing villages, crossroads, and key terrain features. Casualty reports, supply manifests, and after-action summaries all reflect a decisive operational gain. Sherman's, though not invincible, had achieved what was previously thought impossible. Survival against prepared anti-tank defenses, exploitation of terrain, and sustained support for advancing infantry. The psychological impact on German soldiers was long-lasting. Memoirs and interviews revealed disbelief at the tank's resilience. Soldiers who survived described fear, hesitation, and a sense that their defensive calculations had failed. Even experienced officers acknowledged that the Sherman's presence forced rapid, often improvised decisions under fire, undermining doctrine that had guided them through previous engagements. Strategically, the success of Sherman's demonstrated the value of massed, coordinated armored operations combined with infantry support. Lessons from the battle influenced subsequent Allied operations. Emphasis on mobility, protection, and exploiting gaps became central to armored doctrine in Normandy and beyond. For German planners, the encounter highlighted the limitations of static defenses against flexible, well-supported mechanized forces. The engagement underscored a shift in battlefield dynamics. Superiority no longer rested solely on fixed defenses or firepower, but on coordination, movement, and adaptability under pressure. The Sherman tanks had not just survived. They had rewritten the rules of engagement in the sector: steel, courage, and the quiet shift. The Sherman tank's advance was more than a display of machinery. It was a demonstration of the interplay between technology, training, and human resolve. Each vehicle carried men who relied on discipline, coordination, and courage to move through deadly terrain. Armor and firepower provided protection, but it was decision-making under pressure that turned mechanical advantage into battlefield success. For the Germans, the engagement exposed the limitations of even the most prepared defenses. Anti-tank weapons, fortified positions, and tactical doctrine were insufficient against an opponent who combined mobility, flexibility, and initiative. The shock of seeing Sherman survive direct hits shattered expectations and forced rapid improvisation under fire. Strategically, the breakthrough illustrated a key principle of modern warfare. Momentum and adaptability can outweigh static strength. The Sherman's presence enabled infantry and engineers to advance, creating operational opportunities that reshaped the battlefield. It also reinforced the psychological dimension of combat. The perception of invincibility, however temporary, can influence decisions, morale, and the outcome of engagements. The story of a Sherman's rolling unscathed into German lines is a reminder that war is experienced at human scale. It is measured in the hands that steer engines through mud, the eyes that scan hedgerows for threats, and the courage required to press forward when the odds seem insurmountable. Technology mattered, but it was the human will behind it that defined the day. In the end, the tanks did more than pierce lines. They reshaped perception, accelerated operations, and left a lasting imprint on armored warfare doctrine. Omaha, Normandy, or any sector where Shermans moved forward, they carried with them both steel and the quiet certa.